It was the summer of 2003 when 27-year-old Della Pruitt first understood that the world had decided her family's pottery was an inconvenience that needed to be relocated. The notice didn't come by phone. It came the way all truly serious things come to people who live by their hands. On paper, delivered by a stranger in a clean car who left before she could ask him a single question. It was printed on heavy cream-colored stock, the kind of paper that costs more per sheet than she made in an hour at the wheel. It announced, in the cheerful language of inevitability, that Hargrove Pacific Development Group had acquired the 340 acres of coastal bluffland surrounding her property on 3 sides, and would soon begin construction on the Cliffside Collection, a boutique luxury resort described as a curated seaside retreat for discerning travelers seeking an authentic Pacific Northwest experience. She read that phrase twice, authentic. Let me tell you about authenticity. Della Pruitt knew what that word actually meant because she had grown up inside it. The studio her grandmother, Cora Pruitt, had built in 1961 sat on a narrow finger of land where the Oregon coast bent inland, and the wind came off the water tasting of salt and kelp and something older than either. The studio was not beautiful in any conventional sense. The roof had been patched so many times it looked like a quilt. The kiln shed leaned slightly to the north, as if it had been listening to the ocean, so long it had started to lean toward the sound. The floors were raw concrete, permanently stained the color of iron-rich clay. The whole place smelled of wood smoke and wet earth, and the particular mineral sharpness of glazed ceramics, fresh out of a long firing. That smell was her inheritance. It was also her livelihood. Della made what her grandmother had taught her to make: functional, beautiful, imperfect things. Mugs with thick walls and handles that actually fit a grown hand. Bowls glazed in the colors of the tide pools below the bluff, that deep green brown that isn't quite either color. Pitchers with small deliberate asymmetries that told you a human being had made them, not a machine. She sold them from a small shop attached to the studio, and at the Saturday market in town, and increasingly through a modest website her cousin had built for her. She was not getting rich. She had never expected to. She was keeping the studio alive, which was the only thing her grandmother had ever asked of her. The community saw it differently. The town of Horwick Point had been slowly emptying for 15 years. Its fishing economy gutted. Its young people leaving for Portland and Seattle. When word got out that Hargrove Pacific was coming, that there would be construction jobs, resort jobs, a new tax base, the reaction at the coffee shop and the hardware store was the same: relief, gratitude, and a certain quiet expectation that the holdouts, the stubborn few who sat in the middle of all that progress, would eventually do the sensible thing. Della's neighbor, a retired fisherman named Walt Cheswick, who she'd known since childhood, found her loading her kiln one afternoon and pulled her aside with the gentle seriousness of a man delivering medical news. "Dell," he said, "I know what that place means to you, but honey, they're going to build around you regardless. Better to sell now on your terms than to be left sitting in the middle of a parking lot." He squeezed her arm. He meant it kindly. They all did. They looked at her, a single woman in her late 20s with clay under her fingernails, and a mortgage that was technically still in her dead grandmother's name. And they saw someone who needed to be rescued from her own stubbornness. They were looking at the wrong thing. The man from Hargrove Pacific arrived on a Tuesday in early September. His name was Mr. Ferris, not the Mr. Ferris in the file of names her grandmother had kept of difficult customers over the decades, but a new one, the kind produced in business schools and sharpened by development deals. He wore the kind of casual clothes that cost as much as formal ones. He drove a truck that had never carried anything in its bed, He didn't park in her gravel lot. He parked on the access road above it, as if he'd already decided the gravel was beneath his tires. He came down the path to where she was trimming a batch of bowls on the wheel, and he stood in the doorway of the studio, the way people stand in doorways when they don't intend to stay. One hand on the frame, body half turned toward the exit. "Mrs. Pruitt," he said. His voice had the smooth, even quality of a man who had delivered this particular speech many times. "I appreciate your time. I know you've received our correspondence." She kept her hands on the clay. She did not offer him coffee. He explained, as if she might not have understood the letter, that the Cliffside Collection would be a 62-room boutique property with spa facilities, a farm-to-table restaurant, and a series of guest villas positioned along the bluff to maximize the ocean view. The positioning, he said, and here he paused, in a way that was probably meant to seem regretful, was complicated by the presence of her studio, the kiln smoke, the truck deliveries, the noise of the shop, not to mention, he added, the visual impact of an active working studio on the sightlines their architects had designed around. Della turned off the wheel. She wiped her hands on her apron. She looked at him. "The studio has been here for 42 years, she said. "Yes, Mr. Ferris agreed pleasantly, as if this were a charming anecdote. "Which is exactly why we believe you've earned the right to a very comfortable transition." He named a number. It was a real number, a life-changing number, if your life was the kind that could be changed by money. "The studio is not for sale," she said. His expression did not change. "Miss Pruitt, I want to be straightforward with you. The construction process is going to be significant. Months of heavy equipment blasting for the foundation on the north cliff, access roads being cut. The dust alone will compromise your glazes. The vibration from the heavy machinery could crack your kiln. These aren't threats," he said, and his tone made perfectly clear that they were. "They're realities. I understand the realities," Della said. "The studio is not for sale." He left the way he'd arrived, quickly, cleanly, without looking back. She stood in the doorway of the studio and watched his expensive truck reverse up the access road, and she felt, for the first time, the actual size of what she was standing against. He was right about the construction. They broke ground 6 weeks later, and the world she had known since childhood came apart in pieces. The blasting was the worst of it at first. Not just the sound, though that was significant, a deep concussive thud that she felt in her sternum before she heard it, but the aftermath, the fine particulate that settled over everything. Silica dust from the cliff face mixed with the salt air and coated the bisque-fired pieces she left to cool outside. 2 entire batches were ruined, the surface contamination so complete she couldn't sand it out. Her grandmother's kiln, a wood-burning anagama she'd built herself over 3 summers in the 70s, began developing hairline cracks along the side wall. The thermal expansion from firing, combined with the constant micro-vibrations of the construction equipment, was working on the old mortar the way water works on stone, slowly, persistently, invisibly, until the damage was already done. Then there was the light. The construction crews worked late into the evening with portable tower lights, brutal, white industrial floods that turned the bluff into something that looked like a film set. Della threw pottery into the early hours most nights. She always had. The dark and the quiet were part of her process. The way the mind settled into the rhythm of the wheel when there were no other demands on it. The lights killed that. They bleached the darkness out of the night and replaced it with a harsh commercial glare that made everything feel temporary and industrial. She found she couldn't center properly under those lights. Her hands knew something was wrong, even when her mind tried to ignore it. The town's sympathy, what little had existed, evaporated. She wasn't a tragic figure anymore. She was an obstacle. Now let me tell you about the knowledge that saved her. It wasn't in a book, though books were part of it. It lived in a wooden flat file in the back corner of the studio, the kind with wide, shallow drawers meant for architectural drawings. Her grandmother had filled it over 40 years with everything: kiln temperature logs, clay body formulas, glaze chemistry notebooks, firing schedules, correspondence with other potters, and at the very back of the deepest drawer, a folder of what Cora Pruitt had simply labeled the hard years. The hard years, as Della learned reading through it, had been the early 1970s, when the state proposed routing a new coastal highway through the lower portion of the property. Cora hadn't folded. She hadn't hired lawyers. She had instead redesigned her studio's relationship to its site. She'd built the kiln shed into the hillside rather than on top of it. She'd rerouted her drainage. She'd planted a dense strip of shore pine and Sitka spruce along the western edge of the property, not as a gesture, but as engineering. The notes in the folder were meticulous: species selection, spacing intervals, growth rates, root structures, how the trees would eventually create a microclimate that stabilized temperature and humidity on the studio side, which mattered enormously for drying clay and storing raw materials. The highway had never been built, but the trees were still there, now 40 years old, their canopy so dense that the studio side of the property existed in its own weather, its own light, its own silence. Della sat with that folder for a long time. Then she drove to the state extension office and talked to a soil conservationist named Ms. Ogden for 2 hours. She went to the university library in Coos Bay and found 3 studies on acoustic mitigation through strategic windbreaks. She called a structural engineer, a woman her grandmother had corresponded with, and asked about kiln reinforcement against low-frequency vibration. What she was assembling wasn't a defense. It was an adaptation. It was the Pruitt way. That fall, she spent every dollar she had and borrowed a careful amount against the property to begin the work. She reinforced the kiln's side walls with a lime mortar mix the structural engineer specified. She built a secondary clay drying room on the interior of the studio, away from the construction side, where she could control dust and humidity. And she began planting. Not a few trees, a deliberate, engineered planting. Shore pine, in the outermost row for fast establishment, Sitka spruce and grand fir behind them for density and height, and on the interior edge, where the wind would be broken and the light would filter through, a row of red alder and cascara that would eventually create the kind of rich understory that coastal Oregon had before the logging. She planted 230 trees that first winter, working mostly alone, in the rain, in the cold, in the mud that the construction equipment had tracked across the top of the access road. The potter who delivered her clay, a man from Medford who'd known her grandmother, stopped his truck at the top of the rise one afternoon and looked down at her in the field. "Della," he called, "what in the name of common sense are you doing?" "Planting," she called back. He shook his head slowly. "Honey, those trees won't be worth a damn for 10 years. "I know," she said, and went back to digging. The doubt came later, because it always does. It found her on a night in February of the second year, when a 3-day rain had turned the planting field into something that wasn't quite land and wasn't quite water. The construction on the North Cliff had reached the framing stage, and the skeleton of the resort's main building stood against the dark sky like the ribcage of something enormous. Its generator ran all night. She could hear it even inside the studio, a low, purposeful hum that said, without any ambiguity, "We are not stopping." She was sitting on an overturned bucket in the kiln shed, too tired to move, too cold to feel it properly. Her hands were bleeding at two of the knuckles where she'd caught them on a root ball that afternoon. The clay under her nails had mixed with the mud until she couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. She looked at the flickering pilot light of the kiln and thought, what if they're right? What if the sensible thing, the dignified thing, was to take the money, let someone else deal with the cracks in the kiln and the dust in the glaze and go build something new somewhere else, where no one was blasting through the cliff face next door? The thought was so comfortable it frightened her. She looked at the far wall of the kiln shed, where her grandmother had scratched the date of every significant firing directly into the concrete, not written, scratched, with a nail, so it couldn't be erased. Decades of dates, most of them nothing, just work, just the calendar of a woman who showed up every day regardless. But there, in the summer of 1974, was a gap. 4 months of no dates, and then, in what Della recognized as a slightly different hand, shakier, as if written during or just after some kind of difficulty, a single line: the kiln cracked. I fixed it. The work continues. No drama, no resolution, just the facts and the resumption. Della got up off the bucket. She put on a second pair of gloves and went back outside. The construction took 22 months in total. The Cliffside Collection opened in the spring of the 5th year after Miss Ferris's first visit, on a weekend that brought photographers from 3 design magazines and a lifestyle blogger with 500,000 followers. It was everything it had promised. 62 rooms, each with an ocean view, the spa with a hot stone treatment overlooking the bluff, the restaurant with a menu that used the word sourced in almost every description. By that time, Della's trees were 4 years old. Not a wall yet, but a presence. The outer pines had taken hold with the aggression that shore pines show when they find ground they like. The spruce were slower but sturdier. From the construction side, her planting looked like a ragged windbreak, nothing impressive. From inside on the studio side, standing where the trees broke the wind and filtered the light, it already felt like the edge of something protected. Her studio, meanwhile, had changed in ways that only she would have called progress. She'd lost 6 months of production to the worst of the construction. She'd retooled her firing schedule to run the kiln during daylight hours only, adapting to the noise rather than fighting it. She developed a new clay body that was more tolerant of temperature fluctuation, born of necessity when her usual drying conditions became unreliable. She'd shifted more production to smaller pieces, sets of 4 or 6 that were easier to sell individually and less catastrophic to lose if a batch was compromised. Smaller, more refined, more adapted to difficulty. The first sign that something had changed came from the resort itself, and it came sideways, the way the best things often do. A woman named Marin, not the Marin in the old files, a different one, younger, was the Cliffside Collection's opening dining room manager. She had come from a well-regarded restaurant in Portland, and she had been hired specifically to build the locally rooted character of the restaurant that the resort's marketing materials promised. She needed, among other things, distinctive tableware. Not uniform, not mass-produced. Something that told a story. She found Della's website at 11 o'clock on a Thursday night, ordered 6 mugs as a test, and drove down to the studio herself when they arrived to ask if there was more. There was more. There was 42 years of more, in the forms and glazes that Cora Pruitt had developed, and Della had extended and deepened into something new. Marin sat at the work table in the studio for 2 hours, handling piece after piece with the focused attention of someone making an important decision. She held a bowl in both hands and looked at the glaze, that particular tidal green, and said, almost to herself, "This is exactly what the room needs. This is what I've been trying to describe." "Every room," Marin said. The restaurant opened with Pruitt Studio pottery on every table, not a marketing decision, a genuine one, made by a woman who knew what she was looking for and recognized it when she found it. The resort's guests, many of them urban professionals who spent their working lives surrounded by the seamless and the synthetic, reacted with a recognition that bordered on hunger. They picked up the mugs and turned them in their hands. They asked the servers about the asymmetry in the bowl rims, whether it was intentional. They wanted to know who made them. By the end of the first season, the resort's concierge desk had fielded 47 requests for directions to the studio. 47 people who had come for the ocean view and left wanting to find the woman who made the things they'd eaten off of. Now let me tell you about the meeting, because the meeting is the point. It was Mr. Ferris who came back, not Marin. Marin had become something like a collaborator, someone Della actually liked. Mr. Ferris, 18 months after the resort had opened, he drove the same expensive truck, but something in the way he carried himself had changed. The smoothness was still there, but it was working harder than it used to. He found her in the trimming room, running a wire tool along the bottom of a large serving bowl. She did not turn off the wheel this time either. "Mrs. Pruitt," he said from the doorway. "Mr. Ferris," she said, without looking up. He came in this time. He didn't stand in the doorway. He came all the way to the work table and stood across it from her, and she could see in his posture that whatever he had come to say was not the speech he'd been trained to give. "We have a situation," he said. "Our guests have been. The tableware in the restaurant has generated a level of interest that we didn't anticipate. We're getting requests for purchase, for custom pieces, for studio visits." "I know," Della said. "I've been filling those orders." "Yes." He cleared his throat. "The thing is, the volume of interest has reached a point where our executive team believes there may be a formal partnership opportunity. Something more structured." He looked at her steadily. "Something that would be mutually beneficial." Della set the bowl aside. She picked up a cloth and wiped her hands. She had been thinking about this conversation for 6 months. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the studio was still and the trees outside were breathing in the dark. "Before we discuss structure," she said, "I want to be clear about a few things." She reached under the work table and produced a manila folder, her lawyer's work, done with the same slow thoroughness she brought to glaze chemistry. "The first thing is pricing. My pieces are sold at studio retail, not wholesale, not hospitality discount. If the Cliffside Collection is selling my work as part of an experience for which your guests are paying $500 a night, then the price of the work reflects that." She slid the first page across. He looked at the number. She watched him decide not to argue. "The second thing is volume. I produce what the studio produces. I will not add staff, automate processes, or change my materials to meet a quota. The quantity I can offer in a year is fixed, and fixed means fixed. If there are seasons where you cannot get new inventory, that is part of the arrangement." She slid the second page across. He looked at it. "The third thing," Della said, and here she paused, because this was the term she had spent the longest thinking about, the one that mattered most to her in a way that was hard to explain in legal language, but that her lawyer had managed anyway. "The Cliffside Collection will not commission, stock, or feature any other handmade ceramic work from any other maker while we have this agreement in place. If my work is what your guests are asking for, then my work is what they get. Not a version of it, not an alternative to it. The real thing, exclusively." She slid the third page across, and then she added the last thing, the thing that had nothing to do with money. She opened the folder to the final page, where her lawyer had drawn a property map. "My trees are currently young. In 10 years, They will be the thing that determines whether this partnership continues to have value for both of us. The microclimate they create on the studio side of the property is what allows my clay to behave the way it does. It is directly responsible for the quality of what you're selling. She tapped the map. No construction, equipment staging, or resort expansion of any kind within 200 feet of the planting boundary. That buffer is not negotiable. Mr. Ferris looked at the pages arranged in front of him. He looked at her. He looked, briefly, at the trees visible through the studio window, taller than he'd remembered, their tops beginning to move in the ocean wind, in that slow, interconnected way that meant their roots had found each other. He had tried to buy this studio and failed. He had tried to wait her out, and she had instead made herself indispensable. His guests didn't just want her pottery. They wanted the particular quality of thing that could only be made here, in this studio, by this woman, from this clay, in this light. You could not manufacture that quality. You could not source it from someone else. You could only come back, hat in hand, to the person who had been making it before you arrived and would be making it long after you were gone. "I'll need to take these to our legal team," he said. "Of course," Della said. "My lawyer's contact is on the cover page." She picked up the serving bowl and went back to the wheel. The agreement was signed 11 days later, at her kitchen table, over coffee served in mugs she had made herself. The resort's lawyers were there, in their pressed shirts that looked slightly wrong in her low-ceilinged kitchen. Her lawyer was there, comfortable and unhurried. Della signed last. She used a pen her grandmother had kept in the flat file drawer, a cheap ballpoint that had dried out and been refilled so many times the barrel was permanently stained with ink. Cora Pruitt would have appreciated that detail. The years that followed were not a fairy tale. Della never became famous in the way that some makers do. She didn't want that. She wanted what she had always wanted, to make beautiful things in the place where she had learned to make them, without apology, without compromise, without anyone telling her that what she was doing was incompatible with their vision. The contract gave her the financial stability to hire one part-time assistant, a young woman from the community college ceramics program, who turned out to be genuinely talented. The resort relationship brought her work to people who had never walked into a craft fair, who had grown up in apartments with dishes from a box, and who held her bowls at dinner and felt, perhaps for the first time, the difference between something made and something manufactured. Her trees grew. By the 10th year of the planting, the outer pines had reached 30 feet, and the interior alders had created exactly the microclimate her grandmother's notes had predicted, a zone of filtered light and moderated temperature, and profound quiet even on the days when the wind off the ocean was loud enough to drown out conversation on the bluff above. The resort, visible in the early years, became invisible, not because it had gone away, but because the trees had grown tall enough and dense enough to erase it from her world. From the studio side of the property, standing among the ferns and the moss and the slow drip of the coastal rain, you might not know there were 62 guest rooms 200 yards away. You might hear faintly the sound of a helicopter departing on a tour, but you would mostly hear the trees and the water and the long, slow work of the place making itself. Mr. Ferris retired. The resort was purchased by a different hospitality group, and then by another. New managers came with new ideas and new priorities, and each one was told, on their first day, about the Pruitt Studio Agreement, the fixed pricing, the fixed volume, the buffer zone, the exclusivity clause. Each one tested the edges of it in the small ways that managers do. None of them changed it. The guests kept asking for the pottery. The pottery kept being Della Pruitt's. She became, in the way of people who refused to leave the place that made them, a kind of landmark. not famous, known. Young potters drove up the coast to find her, to ask how she had kept the studio alive, how she had managed the pressure, how she had known what to hold on to and what to let go. She would bring them into the studio and walk them through the flat file drawers, the firing logs, the clay formulas, the folder from the hard years, and let them sit with the weight of it. The thing people get wrong, she told one of them, a young man from Eugene with good hands and an anxious expression she recognized, is they think the only choices are fight or leave. They think staying means fighting. It doesn't. She led him to the window that faced the tree line, where the trunks were dark from the rain and the light through the canopy was green and moving. Staying means adapting. It means building something that can outlast the pressure without becoming the pressure. It takes longer than you think you can stand, but what's patient always outlasts what's merely loud. She pressed her palm flat against the cold studio window, the same window her grandmother had pressed her palm against 40 years before her, watching a different threat approach from a different direction. "Make the work," she said. "Plant the trees. The rest will follow."